We're counting down the 10 most unconventional compost tricks that have been discouraged, restricted, or even quietly banned in gardening circles. Ranging from surprising nitrogen sources and misunderstood household wastes to forgotten microbial jumpstarters, these methods all promise to boost decomposition and soil fertility in ways most gardeners never hear about. With each step in the ranking, you'll discover how science, taboo, and old farming wisdom collide, sometimes for good reason, and sometimes because of pure misunderstanding. Which secret technique will take the top spot, and could any safely inspire a soil revival today? Let's begin with the 10th. Few gardening topics spark as much quiet debate as the use of diluted urine in compost piles, a practice at once practical and controversial. For generations, resourceful farmers and homesteaders treated it as a secret tool, an instantly available, highly soluble source of nitrogen that could jolt a sluggish heap into rapid activity. The idea faded in many places as sanitation standards rose and commercial fertilizers became available, yet the method did not disappear from working farms where nothing was wasted. That tension between tradition and modern caution is part of why this trick developed its reputation and why it is worth examining carefully now. Chemically, the explanation is simple and powerful. Fresh human urine contains a high concentration of urea and other nitrogen compounds, giving it a nitrogen-phosphorus-potassium ratio close to 10 to 1 to 2. When diluted and applied to a dry pile at a rate of 1 part urine to 10 parts water, it performs 2 jobs at once. It hydrates what is dry, and it delivers readily available nitrogen to the microbial community. Adding soluble nitrogen lowers the carbon-to-nitrogen balance of a woody or carbon-heavy pile, and that shift often triggers a burst of bacterial growth and a measurable rise in temperature as microbes multiply and decomposition speeds up. The effects on moisture balance and heat are straightforward. A dry heap of leaves or straw will sit almost inert. A measured dose of diluted urine rehydrates fibers and distributes nitrogen deep into the mass when mixed in, helping the pile reach those active microbial temperature ranges more quickly. Faster decomposition generally means less odor if the pile is managed well, because aerobic microbes outcompete the smelly anaerobic pathways. But the method has real risks when misused. Over-application or too little dilution can produce high ammonia levels that actually burn sensitive microbes and plant roots, and repeated heavy use can leave a salty residue that inhibits long-term compost life. Those are the technical reasons gardeners who did not understand the chemistry warned against it. And those same concerns are why many advisory guides discourage the practice without explaining how to do it safely. There are also cultural and social reasons the trick was pushed out of mainstream advice. Using any human byproduct in the garden makes people uncomfortable, and that discomfort often became policy rather than careful guidance. Yet, practical accounts show it worked under the right circumstances. During times of scarcity, gardeners in North America during the Depression turned to urine and other household recycling to keep soils productive, and in some Asian farming traditions, urine recycling is recorded as part of closed-loop systems that supported strong yields for generations. One elderly gardener I met in a small valley once described reviving an entire compost heap after a long drought by adding diluted urine to dry straw, then turning and covering the pile until it became dark and crumbly. For that gardener, the trick was not a novelty, but a matter of survival and tradition. If you are curious about trying this method, there are sensible precautions that address both the science and social concerns. Always dilute, and do not add large amounts at once. Mix treated materials well into the center of a pile so they are consumed by active microbial communities rather than sitting on the surface where they attract pests or produce odors. Preferably allow the compost to go through a full thermophilic phase long enough to stabilize and sanitize the material before using it on edible crops. Avoid applying raw urine directly to root vegetables that will be eaten without thorough cooking, and do not rely on it as a sole fertilizer. Treat it as a kickstart rather than a complete nutrient program. The story of diluted urine in compost is emblematic of a larger theme in gardening history, where effective, low-cost techniques were sometimes shoved aside because they made people uneasy or because their risks were not explained. The science shows why the trick works, the risks explain why it became discouraged, and the old accounts remind us that closed-loop thinking has fed many communities through hard times. Used with moderation and common sense, this forgotten method can safely kickstart microbial growth and teach modern gardeners about the deeper principles that govern decomposition. In the end, the choice to experiment responsibly belongs to each gardener, guided by an appreciation for both tradition and responsibility. The only thing we promote on this channel is our own book, written from the way our grandparents actually lived. Before gardening became complicated, they grew food a little at a time, every day. For them, 30 minutes was enough. So that's why we turned that forgotten knowledge into the 30-minute-a-day garden, a practical guide based on what real families did to stay fed, resilient, and independent. Simply click the first link in the description, or if you're watching on TV, scan the QR code in the right corner, because once this knowledge is gone, it's gone for good. Few composting methods have carried as much promise and controversy as the careful aging of humanure. For centuries, rural families and entire farming communities relied on this practice, transforming human waste into a dense, slow-release fertilizer that could outmatch even the richest animal manures. The method survived by quiet tradition as much as by necessity, a way to return every last nutrient back to the soil when resources were scarce. The science behind aged humanure is exacting. Only when a pile reaches and sustains core temperatures of at least 55 degrees Celsius does it reliably reach the heat needed to greatly reduce pathogens such as E. coli and many parasitic eggs. Insulated bins, sometimes double-walled or built from thick wood, are used to hold that thermophilic phase, keeping heat locked in for weeks so thermophilic microbes can do their work. A vigorous hot stage must be followed by a long resting period, often 12 to 24 months, allowing slower microbial activity and time to finish breaking down resilient material and to further reduce any lingering risks. In practical terms, this method affects every important compost variable. Humanure tends to be rich in nitrogen, so it must be balanced with carbon-rich materials such as straw sawdust or dry leaves to reach a healthy carbon-to-nitrogen ratio and to prevent odors. Moisture must be kept at a damp sponge level, neither bone-dry nor saturated, because too much water shuts out oxygen and encourages anaerobic conditions and smells. Particle size and pile density influence heat buildup and aeration, and regular but gentle turning or staged layering helps control temperature without losing too much heat. When managed correctly, the result is a slow-release source of nitrogen, phosphorus, and organic matter, higher microbial biomass, and a product that improves soil structure and water-holding capacity. At the same time, the risks are real, and the reasons many places discourage or restrict this practice are also practical. Historical urban outbreaks in the 19th century and the later rise of centralized sewage systems shaped strict rules. Today, many regions limit the use of humanure on food crops, require finished material to be buried beneath non-edible plantings, or insist on removal by licensed haulers. Concerns include pathogen survival if the hot stage or the long cure is incomplete, potential residues from pharmaceuticals and personal care products, odors, and attracting pests. Public perception and liability concerns also play a large role in why the practice became frowned upon or effectively banned in some communities. Stories from rural Europe and Asia show how families quietly kept the technique alive, trusting in careful process and long cycles more than quick fixes. For gardeners who study the science and adhere to rules, aged humanure can be a powerful example of closed-loop agriculture, a testament to resourcefulness and strict attention to safety. It is important to stress that this narration does not promote unsafe or illegal activity. Anyone curious about adapting historical methods should follow local regulations, consider professional testing for pathogens and contaminants, and err on the side of long curing times, balanced carbon inputs, proper insulation and aeration, and using finished material only where rules and safety allow. Generations of fishers and smallholders learned the fine points by doing, and the method carries both strong advantages and clear risks. Salt in fresh seaweed can cause plant stress, so traditional practice was to rinse the seaweed in fresh water, or to spread it out to let rain wash away as much of the salt as possible, sometimes removing as much as 90% of the salt before adding it to compost. Without that careful preparation, salt can suppress microbial life and damage seedlings. If fish scraps are left on the surface or added to a low-carbon pile without enough dry material and aeration, the result can be foul, anaerobic rot that attracts pests and creates strong smells. Done correctly, burying fish deep and covering with carbon-rich material balances moisture and carbon-to-nitrogen ratios, promotes a hot aerobic decomposition, and reduces pest interest because the scent is sealed in and the proteins are consumed quickly. In fishing villages from Maine to Cornwall, families quietly mixed these materials into trench composts and old orchard beds, sometimes after a storm left heaps of kelp on the shore. One old orchard keeper remembered saving a failing row of apple trees by digging a trench, layering in fish frames and washed seaweed, and returning the soil after a season, finding darker, more crumbly earth and trees that leafed out stronger the next spring. For modern gardeners, there are safe ways to adapt the idea, such as using small, well-buried amounts, keeping a good layer of dry carbon, rinsing seaweed thoroughly, or using commercial fish emulsion as a controlled, odor-reduced option. Be mindful of neighbors, local regulations, and high salt content, and always allow the compost to fully mature before applying it to young plants. The coastal trick is a reminder that effective composting balances energy, moisture, and minerals, and that traditional practices can still inform careful, responsible use today. Crushed bones once played a quiet but powerful role in the compost heaps of 19th century Europe, where farmers desperate to restore phosphorus to worn-out fields gathered animal bones from kitchens, slaughterhouses, and even old battlefields, then sent them to local bone mills. These mills, some powered by water wheels, ground the brittle remains into a fine meal. Unlike nitrogen, which surges through a compost pile in days or weeks, phosphorus from bone breaks down slowly, and microbes and fungi must first mineralize the dense structure, unlocking orthophosphate ions that plants can actually use. This gradual release turns bone meal into a kind of time capsule for fertility, feeding crops for years after the initial application. The practice was so widespread that it caught the attention of Justus von Liebig, the German chemist who argued fiercely about the sustainability of bone mining. Liebig warned that stripping bones from the land, especially those imported from distant battlefields, would eventually exhaust local resources and force farmers to seek phosphorus elsewhere. His debates with British agriculturalists in the 1840s highlighted a growing tension between natural recycling and industrial extraction. For a time, ground bones were so valuable that they fetched higher prices than grain in some markets. Yet as chemical fertilizers took over, the sight of bone piles and grinding wheels faded from mainstream agriculture, and the method was quietly discouraged as old-fashioned or unsightly. In the biology of compost, bones offer something unique, a steady, reliable source of phosphorus that does not leach away with every rain. When added to a hot pile, they support root growth and flowering long after the initial heat has faded, especially in gardens where phosphorus is scarce. The science remains unchanged. Bone meal provides slow mineralization, a legacy of microbial patience, and the resourcefulness of past generations. Ground bones affect the compost in several distinct ways. Physically, the fine bone meal improves the texture of mature compost without upsetting moisture balance, because the mineral fragments do not hold water the way plant material does. Chemically, bones add concentrated phosphorus and calcium, shifting the carbon to nitrogen ratio only slightly, but boosting the nutrient pool available once microbes break them down. Microbially, bones stimulate fungal activity and populations of phosphorus solubilizing bacteria over months and seasons, rather than days, and they raise the long-term fertility and slow release capacity of the finished compost. There are risks and reasons this trick fell out of favor. Improperly processed bones can attract pests, generate odors if mixed with too much fresh nitrogen, or remain largely untouched in a cold, wet pile where mineralization stalls. The act of collecting bones from slaughter sites or public places raised ethical and sanitary concerns in growing towns. Misuse also led to over-reliance on a dwindling resource, which is exactly what Liebig feared. Modern gardeners who choose to experiment with ground bones can do so safely by sourcing commercially processed bone meal or by thoroughly cleaning and grinding bones before adding small, measured amounts to well-turned, adequately hot compost where microbial activity is vigorous. When used responsibly, this old method can be a safe way to build slow-release phosphorus into a garden, but it requires patience, proper handling, and respect for sanitation. A few gardeners and homesteaders still swear by it, telling stories of orchards that flowered with renewed vigor after a single season of bone-enriched compost. Those accounts remind us that composting is both science and tradition, and that a forgotten trick like ground bones can become a useful tool again, so long as we understand the biology behind it, the practical limitations, and the reasons it was once discouraged. Slaughterhouse blood delivers more nitrogen than almost any other compost ingredient, and when gardeners discovered it, they found a way to supercharge decomposition. For generations, farmers near abattoirs gathered fresh blood and poured it into compost, or mixed it with straw and sawdust. The impact was immediate. Blood, either raw or dried and sold as blood meal, carries about 12% nitrogen by weight, roughly 4 times stronger than typical manure. Microbes swarm the protein and push pile temperatures past 60 degrees Celsius in just days, helping tough stems and weed seeds break down quickly, but that surge comes with risks. Exposed blood releases a sharp metallic odor that drifts far, drawing flies, rats, and stray dogs. Early city ordinances in Boston and London quietly discouraged its use, citing both the stench and the threat of pests. To avoid these problems, skilled composters learned to bury blood deep in the pile and always buffer it with dry carbon, leaves, straw, or wood shavings, so the carbon soaks up excess moisture and helps trap the smell. This simple balancing step cuts down on pest pressure and tempers the nitrogen spike, letting the pile break down more steadily. Blood meal, sold as a powder, offers a cleaner, easier-to-handle option, but its concentrated strength can still scorch sensitive plants or upset the compost's balance if overused. Generations of gardeners learned practical rules by trial and error. Use only a small amount, mix it thoroughly with carbon-rich material, and never leave it exposed where it can attract pests. As a guideline, experienced composters would add no more than a small handful per square foot of pile surface, always working it in and balancing with dry carbon. Used with care, Slaughterhouse blood can turn a slow heap into a real powerhouse, accelerating heat and microbial activity in a way that produces rich, fast compost. Handled poorly, it invites trouble, and that combination of high reward and obvious risks is why many communities discouraged or effectively banned the practice without the careful context that made it safe. Meat and dairy scraps have long been treated as forbidden territory in backyard composting, but their story is more complicated than most guides admit. During World War II, rationing and scarcity pushed rural families to use every available kitchen scrap, including bones, gristle, and even the odd pat of butter scraped from a pan, and those homesteaders discovered that proteins and fats are a unique fuel for the microbes that drive decomposition. The key is temperature, because when meat or cheese is buried deep inside a hot compost pile where the core stays above 55 degrees Celsius, specialized bacteria called thermophiles thrive and produce enzymes such as lipase that break fats and proteins into simpler compounds the pile can absorb. Fats, once written off as a nuisance, actually feed these heat-loving bacteria, helping to raise internal temperature and speeding the breakdown of tough plant matter and stubborn cell walls. The risks are real, and they explain why this practice became discouraged. If a pile runs cool or scraps are left near the surface, the smell of decaying meat can draw rodents, raccoons, and flies from far beyond the garden fence, and that is the complaint many neighbors remember. Municipal ordinances in cities like Seattle and Boston quietly discouraged meat composting in the mid-20th century, blaming backyard piles for pest outbreaks that often stemmed from poor management rather than the ingredients themselves. Experienced composters learned the hard lessons the easy way, discovering that placement and balance make all the difference. When handled correctly, this method can be safe and effective. Gardeners who still use meat and dairy in compost bury those scraps in the hottest part of a pile, always buffer them with dry leaves or straw to maintain a healthy carbon to nitrogen ratio, and monitor temperatures with a long stem thermometer to make sure the core stays consistently hot. That heat not only accelerates decomposition but also helps destroy many common pathogens and keeps odors under control, transforming what was once waste into rich, crumbly humus. For urban gardeners who cannot guarantee sustained high temperatures, the safer choice is to take meat and dairy to a municipal program or to a closed hot composter designed for animal residues, because rules that were written for convenience should not be mistaken for biology. There are small stories that illustrate the point. One Midwestern homesteader quietly fed bones and kitchen trimmings to a well-managed hot pile for decades, and his garden produced unusually deep soil during lean years, while a city gardener who simply tossed dinner scraps on the surface learned quickly that pests follow neglect. The lesson is not that meat and dairy are a magical shortcut, but that their chemistry can be harnessed by heat and care. When we understand how fats affect moisture balance, how proteins change the carbon to nitrogen ratio, and how heat and microbial communities interact, some of these old techniques stop looking reckless and start looking like thoughtful adaptations from a time when nothing was wasted. A spoonful of blackstrap molasses in a bucket of warm water can jolt a compost pile awake. Across the American South and Caribbean, small farmers have long relied on molasses tea as a secret weapon. The reason is simple. Molasses delivers a rush of concentrated, easy carbon energy, fueling microbial communities of bacteria and fungi that break down organic matter. Even 1 tablespoon per gallon, poured over a sluggish pile, can drive temperatures up by 10 or 20 degrees overnight. In Jamaica, homesteaders would soak their heaps at dusk and wake to steaming cores and the sweet tang of fermentation. But this sugar surge comes with risk. As bacteria devour the molasses, their oxygen demand spikes. If the pile is packed tight or not turned, the microbes can outstrip the available air and the heap slips into anaerobic territory. Instead of earthy warmth, sharp, vinegary odors signal lactic acid bacteria taking over. Old-timers warned, never add molasses tea without turning the pile, and never more than a quart or 2 per cubic yard. Aeration is crucial. On a well-fluffed heap, the result is a burst of heat and rapid breakdown of tough stems and leaves. On a compacted pile, it is a recipe for sour pockets and lingering stench. Used with care, dilute, pour, and turn, molasses tea. Transforms kitchen scraps and autumn leaves into finished humus at a speed that still surprises. Fermented plant juices were quietly passed from one gardener to the next, a different kind of compost magic that relied on the invisible work of microbes rather than brute force or raw nutrients. The process began simply. A handful of fresh weeds or vegetable scraps, a spoonful of raw sugar, and a splash of clean water. Within days, wild yeasts and lactic acid bacteria living on the plant surfaces began to multiply, breaking down cell walls and releasing a wave of enzymes into the liquid. This homemade brew, called fermented plant juice, was once a staple among kitchen gardeners in East Asia, where rice water rinses and vegetable trimmings were never wasted. The emphasis was on starting biological activity early, with a low-tech, locally available inoculant that cost almost nothing to make. Microbes were the currency here, not chemicals or heat. When poured over a compost pile, always diluted and used carefully, fermented plant juice acts as a living inoculant. At recommended dilutions, sometimes as low as 1 part juice to 500 parts water, lactic acid bacteria and wild yeasts flood the upper layers and help outcompete spoilage organisms. Gardeners who adopted this method reported that green leaves and fruit scraps seem to vanish up to 30% faster, especially in the early stages when piles can be slow to start. The liquid brings early enzymes and a benign microbial community that softens tissues and makes carbon and nitrogen more available to the wider compost microbiome. The odor, when fermentation is controlled and the juice is fresh, is mildly sweet rather than the sharp sourness of true rot. Lactic fermentation, when done right, tends to suppress unpleasant smells rather than create them. Balance is the critical word, because the same fermentation that helps can also harm if it is concentrated or left to go anaerobic. Skeptics sometimes dismissed fermented plant juice as folk remedy, but there is sound biology behind it. Lactic acid bacteria do more than break down simple sugars in plant tissues. They produce organic acids and other metabolites that can suppress some plant pathogens and create a more hospitable environment for the next wave of aerobic compost microbes. In practice, the trick is about dilution, timing, and aeration. Too much concentrate, or using the brew on a pile that is already wet and compacted, can tip conditions towards sourness and anaerobic decay. Careful dilution, regular turning, and attention to moisture balance keep conditions aerobic, maintain heat where needed, and let the inoculant accelerate decomposition without encouraging pests or odors. The principle is straightforward. Feed the right microbes at the right time, and the pile will follow. There are small stories that capture how this method circulated. An older homesteader once kept a half-liter jar of fermented plant juice near the kitchen, topping it up with kitchen scraps and rice water until it smelled faintly sweet. In spring, after a long winter with little nitrogen inputs, she would dilute a small cup in a watering can and wet the surface of a new compost heap. Neighbors noticed faster breakdown and richer-looking compost by late summer. Farmers who had no access to commercial starters turned to these low-tech brews because they were resilient, cheap, and based on local materials. Those successes helped spread the technique, even as mainstream extension services later advised caution without always explaining the specifics. Why did fermented plant juice become discouraged or unofficially banned in some communities? Partly because of misunderstanding, and partly because of inconsistent results when people skipped essential steps. When the brew was used too strong, stored too long, or applied to anaerobic piles, it could create bad smells and draw flies, which made it an easy target for critics. Without direction on dilution and aeration, novices could unintentionally create problems and then blame the method rather than the application. Education, not prohibition, would have been a more useful response. When taught correctly, fermented plant juice can be a safe and effective microbial starter that improves early-stage decay and supports a healthy, diverse compost community. If you choose to experiment with fermented plant juice, keep a few safety and practical points in mind. Use fresh materials, keep the fermentation short and monitored, dilute generously before application, and never apply concentrate to compacted or waterlogged piles. Think of the juice as a microbial nudge, not a replacement for good carbon to nitrogen balance, aeration, and moisture control. Historically, these brews worked because they were integrated into an overall system of turning, layering, and feeding the pile. In that context, fermented plant juice refined composting from simple fuel management into a more sophisticated microbial choreography. It is a reminder that tradition and small-scale experimentation often contain practical knowledge, as long as we understand the science behind the practice and adapt it responsibly. Wool and hair, often overlooked as simple grooming waste, hold a quiet power in the world of compost. For centuries, shepherds and homesteaders gathered wool clippings after spring shearings, mixing them straight into garden heaps or layering them beneath autumn leaves. The secret lies in keratin, the tough protein that gives wool and hair their resilience. Unlike the fast-burning nitrogen found in blood or urine, keratin is locked tight, resisting both rain and microbial attack. Only specialized fungi and a handful of keratin-eating bacteria can break it down, and even then, the process unfolds slowly, releasing nitrogen, sulfur, and small amounts of potassium over a span of months rather than days. Modern trials and the observations of older farmers confirm what those traditions suggested, that when shredded and blended through a compost pile, wool and hair act as a slow-release matrix, holding moisture in their tangled fibers while feeding the pile's fungal community. Moisture tests show that a layer of wool can absorb up to 30% of its weight in water, buffering a pile through dry spells and keeping microbes active long after other materials have dried out. As the fibers gradually decompose, they provide a steady trickle of nutrients, never overwhelming the heap or risking ammonia spikes, but instead fueling a gentle, season-long fermentation that builds humus from the inside out. There is a simple science behind this. The physical structure of wool traps air and water, improving the pile's moisture balance and insulation, which in turn supports fungal growth and steady heat production. Because keratin resists rapid bacterial attack, decomposition leans toward fungal-dominated pathways, producing more complex, stable organic matter. That slower pathway affects the carbon-to-nitrogen ratio differently than a hot, fast pile. Instead of a sudden surge of nitrogen and heat, gardeners get a prolonged, moderated release of nutrients and improved soil texture. The result is compost that enhances water retention and soil structure in ways that quick composting methods do not. In some regions, gardeners quietly discouraged adding wool and hair, calling it too slow, too difficult, or a waste when fast compost was the goal. Others feared that clumps of hair might trap pests or create mats that shed water, or they simply did not understand the fungal partners required to break down keratin. There are myths about foul odors and pathogen risks, but in practice, properly mixed and shredded wool rarely smells and does not introduce disease. The real requirement is patience and a little technique. Finely cut fibers mixed with a balance of carbon-rich material to prevent matting, and kept aerated so decomposition can proceed safely. Stories from older homesteads remind us that resourceful gardeners used whatever came to hand, and when sheep were plentiful, wool became a valued slow amendment. One gardener recalled tucking clippings under a mulch of leaves in autumn and finding by spring a dark, spongy layer that held water through summer droughts. The lesson is not that wool and hair are a quick fix, but that they are a reliable, low-risk way to build long-term soil resilience when used with care. This is a composting idea rooted in tradition, offering a different path to healthy soil, one that asks for time and returns a steady, gentle reward. Porous charcoal, known to many as biochar, quietly changed how some gardeners think about compost. Unlike the fleeting rush of nitrogen from blood meal or the slow trickle of nutrients from hair and wool, biochar offers something almost permanent, a microscopic structure that turns every handful of compost into a habitat for billions of microbes. The secret is its enormous internal surface area. A single teaspoon of biochar can contain as much internal surface as a football field, riddled with tiny pores that trap water, nutrients, and the bacteria and fungi that drive decomposition. Raw biochar is deceptively simple to the eye, but it behaves like a hungry sponge in a compost pile. In its uncharged state, it soaks up nitrogen and dissolved minerals, locking them away where plants and microbes cannot reach them. That is why older gardeners and homesteaders insisted on charged biochar, a step that turns a nutrient thief into a nutrient bank. Charging means soaking the charcoal in nutrient-rich liquids, for example compost tea, a diluted urine solution, or a slurry made from finished compost. Those liquids preload the pores with nitrogen, soluble minerals, and microbial life, so the charcoal no longer scrubs the pile of nutrients, it holds them for slow release. The science behind this is straightforward and easy to follow. Biochar supplies surface and structure more than food. When its pores are full of water and nutrient-rich microbes, the C to N balance in the surrounding compost becomes more stable. Pores shelter microbes from rapid fluctuations in moisture and temperature, and they reduce nutrient leaching during heavy rains. Field trials and agricultural research from Brazil and Japan found that adding about 5 to 10% charged biochar by volume to a compost pile or to amended soil increased measurable microbial activity and nutrient retention for years rather than weeks. In some studies, nutrient loss was reduced by up to 50%. Odors often drop as well because volatile compounds cling to the charcoal surface instead of drifting off into the air. That does not mean there are no risks or reasons this trick was sometimes discouraged. If applied raw, biochar can immobilize nitrogen and slow early decomposition, which looks like poor composting to someone who expects instant results. If the charcoal was produced from treated lumber, painted wood, or contaminated biomass, it can introduce harmful compounds or heavy metals, so sourcing matters. Using urine or other organic liquid feeds requires simple hygiene and dilution, so pathogens are not spread inadvertently. Misuse, poor explanation, and a lack of trusted how-to guidance made some communities warn against biochar, even though the underlying practice can be safe and effective. Gardeners who used this method quietly reported striking changes. One small-scale farmer found that after he charged and mixed biochar into his compost, his piles held heat longer during cool weather and dried more slowly during hot spells. Another backyard gardener mixed a batch of charged biochar into a raised bed and noticed the soil held moisture through a dry spell, and seedlings showed steadier growth. The practical how-to is intentional but simple, and it honors those old practices while keeping modern safety in mind. Rinse or screen the biochar to remove fine dust. Soak it for several days in a nutrient-rich brew until it no longer soaks up clear liquid, then mix it into compost or soil at modest rates, around 5 to 10% by volume depending on conditions. Avoid treated wood and test new sources at a small scale before wide use. Few compost amendments offer the same combination of immediate habitat for microbes and long-term presence in the soil. Charged biochar does not break down, it lingers as a scaffold for future generations of bacteria and fungi, strengthening water retention and nutrient stability over seasons. For gardeners who want a compost trick that is transformative yet safe when done correctly, charged biochar is as close to a permanent upgrade as nature allows. Across all 10 entries, one truth stands out: composting thrives on experimentation and adaptation, not rigid rules. What is considered off-limits often reflects changing fears, not scientific limits. Today, old taboos reveal new opportunities for soil health if we understand the science behind them. In the end, the compost pile is a living laboratory where tradition, curiosity, and responsible risk create tomorrow's fertile ground.